One company, a single company so massive that contributes roughly 1 out of every $5 in the world's 14th largest and Asia's fourth largest economy, which accounted for about $1.87 trillion in GDP in the year 2024. In the US, Apple is massive, so is Google and Amazon. But if Apple ceases to exist tomorrow, America wouldn't collapse. But in South Korea, if this one company disappeared, the entire nation's economy will collapse. The company I'm talking about is Samsung, or the Samsung, shall I say. So, how does something like that happen? How can one company become so big, so systematically important that it becomes the identity, economy, and future of an entire country? I would like to discuss that today. After the Korean War ended, which was fought between 1950 to 1953, South Korea was one of the poorest countries on earth. So poor, in fact, the GDP per capita was lower than some African nations. The country didn't have any oil and it barely had any natural resources, but it had something else, a national obsession with development. The government at the time basically decided we'll pick a few companies, we will feed them with the capital, support them in every way possible, and push them to compete globally. That strategy turned out to be very effective and gave birth to Chaebols, a giant family owned conglomerates. Now, I'm sure you must have heard at least one of these names: Hyundai, LG, SK Group. But the biggest of them all, can you guess? That's right, it's Samsung. Now, companies usually scale because the market wants their products. Companies grow, get listed on the stock market, and raise capital through investors. But in South Korea, during the early decades, the government chose the winners. Samsung did not just figure it out, Samsung was intentionally fueled. They were given cheap loans, they were awarded government contracts, and they were favored with industrial policy support. Why? Because the government wanted global champions, brands that could go out in the world, make it big, and bring the wealth back home. Samsung was the spear. In the US, companies specialize and have their own niche. For example, Apple designs, TSMC does the fabrication, Foxconn does the assembly. South Korea couldn't afford that model. They needed full stack integration. So Samsung was asked to build everything in house: electronics, shipbuilding, insurance, construction, banking. This is where the identity merges. Samsung is not just a phone brand. In South Korea, Samsung builds your skyscrapers, ensures your family, makes the chips inside your phone, builds the ships that carry Korean exports, finances your mortgage. It's everywhere. In South Korea, Samsung is almost an entire ecosystem. In the year 1990 came a turning point in the history of the company. It had gone all in on chips, DRAM, and flash memory. At the time, this was insanely risky. There were big players in the global markets from Intel, Micron, Motorola in the US, to Toshiba, NEC, and Hitachi in Japan. Competition was brutal. Memory chips were brutal. They were capital heavy, had very low margins, and were very cyclical. But Samsung didn't care. They were into it for a very long game. Around the end of 20th century, the internet exploded. Soon after that, it was time for smartphones. Industry exploded. Demand for memory shot through the roof. Samsung wasn't just lucky, it was positioned for it. And in all of that chaos, Samsung wasn't just a big Korean company anymore. It was the backbone of global consumer electronics. Time went on and the company grew with it. By end of 2025, Samsung is about 20% of South Korea's GDP. It is so large that if Samsung has a bad quarter, the Korean stock market index falls. The news headlines literally say the economy slowed because Samsung slowed. When one company becomes this important, the country becomes vulnerable. Samsung must succeed. Samsung cannot fail. Samsung cannot be allowed to fall behind in semiconductors because South Korea's economic engine is tied to Samsung. So sometimes Samsung is treated differently because it's not just a private corporation, it's a national asset. In this relationship, the line between business and country starts to blur. However, there is another layer to this story, and this is the part people outside Korea rarely understand. When a company becomes this large, when a company is literally tied to the national economy, the usual rules of accountability start to break. Samsung is not just competing in the free market, it is protected, insulated, and sometimes shielded. South Korea has tried many times to limit the power of the Chaebols, but again and again, Samsung has proven that it is too big to be punished. In 2007, Samsung's then chairman Lee Gin-hee was convicted of for massive corruption and financial crimes. He was found guilty. He received a prison sentence, but the sentence was suspended. He never spent a single day in prison, and later he was fully pardoned. Why? Because the argument was very simple. Samsung is too important for the Korean economy. We cannot risk hurting it. This wasn't the last time. In 2017, Lee Jae-yong, the heir, was involved in a huge bribery scandal at the highest levels of Korean politics. Even the president of South Korea was impeached in that scandal. Lee Jae-yong went to prison and then he was released. South Korea literally passed pardons because the argument was we need Samsung to lead the semiconductor race. So the national interests matter more than the punishment. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Samsung is not just a private business. In South Korea, Samsung has become a political force, an institution, power center, a force that can influence policy, a force that can influence regulations, and a force that can influence elections. And when a company reaches that level of power, the line between democracy and corporate necessity becomes thin. This is the downside of national dependence. Yes, Samsung built economic strength. Yes, Samsung helped lift millions into the middle class. And also, yes, Samsung made South Korea globally respected. But it also means if Samsung fails, the nation suffers. So the nation cannot allow Samsung to fail. And when failure is impossible, accountability becomes optional. This is the part of the story that the world doesn't see. Behind the beautiful flagship phones, behind the giant ships, behind the glittering towers, there is a quiet reality. Samsung's power is not just economic, it is systemic, structural, and political. And when a company becomes that important, it doesn't just reflect the nation, it shapes it. There is a deeper philosophical question hiding in the Samsung story. Should nations pick the winners? In most Western economies, The answer has historically been no. In all the countries, which are mostly capitalist, it is believed to have a free market where companies compete naturally, winners emerge on merit, and the government stays mostly out of the way. South Korea did the opposite. It deliberately chose its national champions, not as an accident, not as a prediction, but as a strategic action. The government looked at global competition and said, we need a company that can represent us on a world stage. And that's where Samsung came in. This raises a profound policy question. Is that actually a better model for the 21st century? Because when a nation picks winners, it compresses time. Instead of waiting 30 years for natural market evolution, it forces the emergence of a world class company quickly. The upside: speed, global presence, national identity. The downside: concentration of power, fragile diversity of industries. With all this, an entire economy becomes psychologically dependent on a handful of players. Well, in South Korea's case, this worked. Samsung didn't become big because it was lucky, it became big because South Korea made an intentional bet and won. But this strategy only works if the government is very good at knowing what the future would look like, which is rare. Is that a sustainable strategy for every nation? Or was this a unique moment in a unique country with a unique company? I'll leave it to your thoughts.